Hi class, I really appreciate you watching this video. I was afraid that you wouldn't watch it because it's been so long since you've had to watch a video before class. But thank you for being here and watching the reading of Wild by Cheryl Strayed. We're going to start it right now. And before we read it, I want to remind you what you are going to be writing about after we read this text. And when we're in class, we'll review this. But you are going to be writing an argumentative paragraph that responds to the prompt. A journey is the best way to discover yourself. So you are going to either agree or disagree with that statement, that a journey is the best way to discover yourself. So think about that as I'm reading Wild, and think if you agree or if you disagree, and if you can find reasons why to agree or why to disagree with this statement as I'm reading. And you should be looking for things that you can underline, good quotes or good sections that you could summarize in order to support your opinion on this prompt. So this reading is in your assignment packet. It is located right after assignment 14. You should find it no problem. So please make sure to turn to this assignment in your book. And if I make a mark on my page, then you are going to make the same mark on your page. So this is from Wild by Cheryl Strayed. Cheryl Strayed was born in 1968, was 27 years old and struggling to cope after the death of her mother when she decided to embark alone on a 2,663-mile hike from California to Oregon. Her intrepid journey, both physical and psychological, renewed her sense of self and survival. So she hiked 2,663 miles from California to Oregon. I mean, have you ever driven to Oregon? It's a long drive. I cannot imagine hiking. And she didn't take an easy route. She went a difficult route, up and down mountains. And we'll talk about this more in class next week. But just imagine hiking that much. The Pacific Crest National Scenic Trail, PCT, extends from the border of Canada to the border of Mexico. The trail follows the crests of the Cascade and Sierra Nevada mountain ranges and passes through 3 states and 7 national parks. Fewer than 200 hikers attempt the entire length each year. This excerpt is from Strayed's memoir about hiking. The PCT takes place after she had been on the trail for about 3 weeks and had decided to avoid crossing the Sierra Nevada due to dangerous snow and ice. So she decided, because there was so much snow and ice, she was going to bypass the snow and ice section. But then she soon learned that she didn't go far enough north, and she did not bypass the snow and ice because she is going to encounter snow and ice. And remember, she's all alone. So if she gets lost, or if she falls, or if she dies or gets hurt, no one's going to know because she's alone. So just keep that in mind. And she's a girl who's 26 years old. I'd passed by. I was out of danger now. I'd leapfrogged over the snow. It was clear sailing through the rest of California, I supposed. Then through Oregon to Washington, my new destination was a bridge that crossed the Columbia River, which formed the border between the 2 states, the Bridge of the Gods. It was 1,008 trail miles away. I'd hiked only 170 so far, but my pace was picking up. Okay, so she decided that she was going to now hike to the Bridge of the Gods. that was 1,000 miles away. She'd only hiked 170 miles, which is still farther than I've ever hiked. In the morning, Greg and I walked out of Sierra City for 1.5 miles along the shoulder of the road until we reached the place where it intersected the PCT, then walked together for a few minutes on the trail before pausing to say goodbye. That's called mountain misery, I said, pointing at the low green bushes that edged the trail. Or at least that's what the guidebook says. Let's hope it's not literal. I think it might be, Greg said, and he was right. The trail would rise nearly 3,000 feet over the 8 miles ahead. I was braced for the day. Monster, loaded down with a week's worth of food. Good luck, he said, his brown eyes meeting mine. So Monster is the name she gave the backpack that she held her sleeping bag in, her tent, her food, and all of the things she needed because she was just going to sleep on the trail. Before it got dark, she would set up camp, sleep, and then wake up the next morning and keep hiking. Good luck to you too. I pulled him into a hard embrace. Stay with it, Cheryl, he said as he turned to go. You too, I called after him as if he wouldn't. Within 10 minutes, he was out of sight. I was excited to be back on the trail, 450 PCT miles north of where I'd been. The snowy peaks and high granite cliffs of the High Sierra were no longer in view, but the trail felt the same to me. In many ways, it looked the same too. For all the endless mountain and desert panoramas I'd seen, it was the sight of the 2-foot wide swath of the trail that was the most familiar, the thing upon which my eyes were almost always trained, looking for roots and branches, snakes and stones. Sometimes the trail was sandy, other times rocky or muddy or pebbly or cushioned with layers upon layers of pine needles. It could be black or brown or gray or blonde as butterscotch, but it was always the PCT, home base. So it didn't matter how far she went or all the places she passed by. What she looked at the most was the trail beneath her feet. And if you've ever gone hiking, you do tend to just kind of look down in front of you when you're hiking because the trail is not flat. There's rocks and logs and things. And if you don't look down, you could easily trip. We're on paragraph 10. I walked beneath a forest of pine, oak, and incense cedar, then passed through a stand of Douglas firs as the trail switchbacked up and up. See no one all that sunny morning as I ascended, though I could feel Greg's invisible presence. With each mile, that feeling waned as I imagined him getting farther and farther ahead of me, hiking at his customary blazing pace. The trail passed from the shady forest to an exposed ridge where I could see the canyon below me for miles, the rocky buttes overhead. By midday, I was up above 7,000 feet and the trail grew muddy, though it hadn't rained in days. And finally, when I rounded a bend, I came upon a field of snow, or rather, what I took to be a field, which implied there was an end to it. I stood at its edge in search for Greg's footprints, but saw none. The snow wasn't on a slope, just a flat among a sparse forest, which was a good thing since I didn't have my ice axe any longer. I left it that morning in the PCT hiker free box at the Sierra City post office as Greg and I strolled out of town. I didn't have the money to mail it back to Lisa's, much to my regret, given its expense, but I wasn't willing to carry it either, believing I'd have no use for it from here on out. I jabbed my ski pole into the snow, skidded onto its icy surface, and began to walk, a feat I achieved only intermittently. In some places, I skittered over the top of it. In others, my feet crashed through, sometimes forming potholes halfway up to my knees. Before long, the snow was packed into the ankles of my boots. My lower legs so sunburned, so snowburned, it felt as if the flesh had been scraped away with a dull knife. What worried me less than the fact that I couldn't see the trail, that worried me less than the fact that I couldn't see the trail because it was buried beneath the snow. The route seemed apparent enough. I assured myself, holding the pages from my guidebook as I walked, pausing to study each word as I went. After an hour, I stopped, suddenly scared. Was I on the PCT? All the while, I'd been searching for the small metal diamond-shaped PCT markers that were occasionally tacked to trees, but I hadn't seen any. This wasn't necessarily reason for alarm. I'd learned that the PCT markers were not to be relied upon. On some stretches, they appeared every few miles. On others, I'd hike days without spotting one. I pulled the topographical map of this area out of my shorts pocket. When I did, the nickel in my pocket came with it and fell into the snow. I reached for it, bending over unsteadily beneath my pack. Spur the moment my fingers grazed it, the nickel sank deeper and disappeared. I clawed through the snow looking for it, but it was gone. Now I only had 60 cents. So she has very, very little money. And now all of a sudden she can't see the trail because it's buried beneath snow. So what's going to happen if she gets lost? Yeah, exactly. Nothing good. I remember the nickel in Vegas, the one with which I'd played the slots and won $60. I laughed out loud thinking about it, feeling as if these two nickels were connected, though I couldn't explain why, other than to say that daffy thought came to me as I stood there in the snow that day. Maybe losing the nickel was good luck, the same way that the black feather that symbolized the void actually meant something positive. Maybe I wasn't really in the very midst of the thing I just worked so hard to avoid. Maybe around the next bend, I'd be in the clear. I was shivering by now, standing in the snow in my shorts and sweat-drenched t-shirt, but I didn't dare continue on until I got my bearings. I unfolded the guidebook pages and read what the authors of the Pacific Crest Trail, Volume 1, California, had to say about this portion of the trail. From the trailside ridge, you confront a steady, bush-lined ascent. It's said to describe the place I thought I might have been. Eventually, your trail levels off at an open forested flat. I turned in a slow circle, getting a 360-degree view. Was this the open forested flat? It would seem that the answer would be clear, but it was not. It was only clear that everything was buried in snow. I reached for my compass, which hung from a cord on the side of my pack near the world's loudest whistle. I hadn't used it since the day I was hiking on that road after my first hard week on the trail. I studied it in conjunction with the map and made my best guess about where I might be and walked on, inching forward uncertainly on the snow, alternately skidding across the top or breaking through the surface, my shins and calves growing ever more chafed each time. An hour later, I saw a metal diamond that said Pacific Crest Trail tacked to the snowbound tree, and my body flooded with relief. I still didn't know precisely where I was, but at least I knew I was on the PCT. By late afternoon, I came to a ridgeline from which I could see down into a deep, snow-filled bowl. "Greg!" I called to test if he was near. I hadn't seen a sign of him all day long, but I kept expecting him to appear, hoping the snow would slow him enough that I'd catch him and we could navigate through it together. I heard faint shouts and saw a trio of skiers on an adjoining ridge on the other side of the snowy bowl, close enough to hear, but impossible to reach. They waved their arms in big motions to me and I waved back. They were far enough away and dressed in enough ski gear that I couldn't make out whether they were male or female. "Where are we?" I yelled across the snow expanse. "What?" I barely heard them yell back. I repeated the words over and over again. "Where are we? Where are we?" Until my throat grew raw. I knew approximately where I believed myself to be, but I wanted to hear what they'd say just to be sure. I asked and asked without getting through. So I tried one last time, putting everything I had into it, practically hurling myself off the side of the mountain with the effort. "Where are we?" There was a pause, which told me they'd finally registered my question. And then in unison, they yelled back, "California!" By the way they fell against one another, I knew they were laughing. "Thanks," I called out sarcastically, though my tone was lost in the wind. They called something back to me that I couldn't quite make out. They repeated it again and again, but it got muddled each time until finally they shouted out the words one by one and I heard them. "Are you lost?" I thought about it for a moment. If I said yes, they'd rescue me and I'd be done with this godforsaken trail. "No," I roared. I wasn't lost. I was screwed. So she had a chance to be rescued, but she didn't take that chance, even though she says she was screwed. Why would she not want to be rescued? I looked around at the trees, the waning light slanting through them. It would be evening soon, and I'd have to find a place to camp. I would pitch my tent in the snow and wake in the snow and continue on in the snow. This in spite of everything I'd done to avoid it. I walked on and eventually found what passed for a fairly cozy spot to pitch a tent when you have no choice but to allow a frozen sheaf of snow beneath a tree to be cozy. When I crawled into my sleeping bag, wearing my rain gear over all my clothes, I was chilly, but okay. My water bottles wedged in close beside me so they wouldn't freeze. In the morning, the walls of my tent were covered with swirls of frost, condensation from my breath that had frozen in the night. I lay quiet, but awake for a while, not ready to confront the snow yet, listening to the songs of birds I couldn't name. I only knew that the sound of them had become familiar to me. When I sat up and unzipped the door and looked out, I watched the birds flitter from tree to tree, elegant and plain and indifferent to me. I got my pot and poured water and, better than milk, into it and stirred, then added some granola and sat eating it near the open door of my tent, hoping that I was still on the PCT. I stood and washed out my pot with a handful of snow and scanned the landscape. I was surrounded by rocks and trees that jutted out from the icy snow. I felt both uneasy about my situation and astounded by the vast, lonesome beauty. Should I continue on or turn back? I wondered, though I knew my answer. I could feel it lodged in my gut. Of course I was continuing on. I'd worked too hard to get here to do otherwise. Turning back made logical sense. I could retrace my steps to Sierra City and catch another ride farther north still, clear of the snow. It was safe. It was reasonable. It was probably the right thing to do, but nothing in me would do it. Okay. I'm going to write a question on the side. Why wouldn't she turn back? Why wouldn't she go back? Why wouldn't she stop her journey? Why would she decide to continue on? Even though it's freezing, she can't see the trail, she could get lost. I walked all day, falling and skidding and trudging along, bracing so hard with my ski pole that my hand blistered. I switched to the other hand and it blistered too. Around every bend and over every ridge and on the other side of every meadow, I hoped there would be no more snow. But there was always more snow amid the occasional patches where the ground was visible. Is that the PCT? I wondered when I saw the actual ground. I could never be certain. Only time would tell. I sweated as I hiked, the whole backside of me wet where my pack covered my body, regardless of the temperature or what clothing I wore. When I stopped, I began shivering within minutes, my wet clothes suddenly icy cold. My muscles had at last begun to adjust to the demands of long-distance hiking, but now new demands were placed on them, and not only to brace myself in the constant effort to stay upright. If the ground upon which I was walking was on a slope, I had to chop out each step in order to get my footing, lest I slip down the mountain and crash into the rocks and bushes and trees below. Or worse, I go sailing over the edge. Methodically, I kicked into the snow's icy crust, making footholds step by step. I remember Greg teaching me how to do this very thing with my ice axe back in Kennedy Meadows. Now I wished for that ice axe with an almost pathological fervor, picturing it sitting uselessly in the PCT hiker free box in Sierra City. With all the kicking and bracing, my feet blistered in new places, as well as in all the old places that had blistered back in my first days of hiking. The flesh on my hips and shoulders still rubbed raw by monsters' straps. I walked on, a penitent to the trail, my progress distressingly slow. I'd generally been covering 2 miles an hour as I hiked most days, but everything was different in the snow, slower, less certain. I thought it would take me 6 days to reach Belden town, but when I'd packed my food bag with 6 days worth of food, I didn't have any idea what I'd encounter. 6 days in these conditions were out of the question. And not only for the physical challenge of moving through the snow, each step was also a calculated effort to stay approximately on what I hoped was the PCT. With my map and compass in hand, I tried to remember all I could from Staying Found, which I burned long ago. Many of the techniques, triangulating and cross-bearing and bracketing, had perplexed me even when I'd been holding the book in my hand. Now they were impossible to do with any confidence. I never had a mind for math. I simply couldn't hold the formulas and numbers in my head. It was a logic that made little sense to me. In my perception, the world wasn't a graph or formula or an equation. It was a story. So mostly I relied on the narrative descriptions in my guidebook, reading them over and over, matching them up with my maps, attempting to divine the intent and nuance of every word and phrase. It was like being inside a giant standardized test question. If Cheryl climbs north along a ridge for an hour at a rate of 1.5 miles per hour, then west to a saddle from which she can see 2 oblong lakes to the east, is she standing on the south flank of peak 7,503? I guessed and guessed again, measuring, reading, pausing, calculating, and counting before ultimately putting my faith in whatever I believed to be true. Fortunately, this stretch of the trail held plenty of clues, riddled with peaks and cliffs, lakes and ponds that were often visible from the trail. I still had the same feeling as I had from the start, when I began walking the Sierra Nevada from its southern beginning, as if I were perched above the whole world, looking down on so much. I pushed from ridge to ridge, feeling relieved when I spotted bare ground in the patches where the sun had melted the snow clean away, quivering with joy when I identified a body of water or a particular rock formation that matched what the map reflected or the guidebook described. In those moments, I felt strong and calm. And then a moment later, when I paused yet again to take stock, I became certain that I'd done a very, very stupid thing in opting to continue on. So I'm going to underline this sentence. So it's like constant second guessing yourself. I passed trees that seemed disconcertingly familiar, as if I'd surely passed them an hour before. I gazed across vast stretches of mountains that struck me as not so different from the vast stretch I'd seen earlier. I scanned the ground for footprints, hoping to be reassured by even the slightest sign of another human being, but saw none. I saw only animal tracks, the soft zigzags of rabbits or the scampering triangles of what I suppose were porcupines or raccoons. The air came alive with the sound of the wind whipping the trees at times, and at other times it was profoundly hushed by the endless silencing snow. Everything but me seemed utterly certain of itself. The sky didn't wonder where it was. "Hello," I bellowed periodically, knowing each time that no one would answer, but needing to hear a voice anyway, even if it was only my own. My voice would guard me against it, I believed. It being the possibility that I could be lost in this snowy wilderness forever. Let's underline that phrase. Paragraph 42 at the bottom of page 28. Uncertain as I was, I pushed forward. I felt right in my pushing, as if the effort itself meant something, that perhaps being amidst the undesecrated beauty of the wilderness meant I too could be undesecrated, regardless of what I'd lost or what had been taken from me, regardless of the regrettable things I'd done to others or myself, or the regrettable things that had been done to me. So she is learning about herself on her journey. Of all the things I'd been skeptical about, I didn't feel skeptical about this. The wilderness had a clarity that included me. Somber and elated, I walked in the cool air, the sun glimmering through the trees, bright against the snow, even though I had my sunglasses on. As omnipresent as the snow was, I also sensed its waning, melting imperceptibly by the minute all around me. It seemed as alive in its dying as a hive of bees was in its life. Sometimes I passed by places where I heard a gurgling as if a stream ran beneath the snow, impossible to see. Other times it fell in great wet heaps. Other times it fell in great wet heaps from the branches of the trees. On my third day out from Sierra City, as I sat hunched near the open door of my tent, doctoring my blistered feet, I realized the day before had been the 4th of July. The fact that I could so clearly imagine what not only my friends, but also a good portion of the residents of the United States had done without me made me feel all the more far away. No doubt they'd had parties and parades, acquired sunburns and lit firecrackers, while I was here, cold, alone in the cold. In a flash, I could see myself from far above, a speck on the great mass of green and white, no more or less significant than a single one of the nameless birds in the trees. Here could be the 4th of July or the 10th of December. These mountains didn't count the days. The next morning, I walked through the snow for hours until I came to a clearing where there was a large fallen tree, its trunk bare of both snow and branches. I took my pack off and climbed up on top of it, its bark rough beneath me. I pulled a few strips of beef jerky out of my pack and sat eating it and swigging my water. Soon I saw a streak of red to my right, a fox walking into the clearing, its paws landing soundlessly on top of the snow. He gazed straight ahead without looking at me, not even seeming to know I was there, though that seemed impossible. When the fox was directly in front of me, perhaps 10 feet away, he stopped and turned his head and looked peaceably in my direction, his eyes not exactly going to mine as he sniffed. He looked part feline, part canine, his facial features sharp and compact, his body alert. My heart raced, but I sat perfectly still, fighting the urge to scramble to my feet and leap behind the tree for protection. I didn't know what the fox would do next. I didn't think he would harm me, but I couldn't help but fear that he would. He was barely knee-high, though his strength was irrefutable, his beauty dazzling, his superiority to me apparent down to his every pristine hair. He could be on me in a flash. This was his world. He was as certain as the sky. "Fox," I whispered in the gentlest possible voice I could, as if by naming him, I could both defend myself against him and also draw him nearer. He raised his fine-boned red head, but remained standing as he'd been and studied me for several seconds more before turning away without alarm to continue walking across the clearing and into the trees. "Come back," I called lightly, and then suddenly shouted, "Mom, Mom, Mom, Mom." I didn't know the word was going to come out of my mouth until it did. And then, just as suddenly, I went silent, spent. Now, one thing you don't know is that before she went on this hike, her mother died, and her mother was a single mother and raised her, and they were very, very close. And so she's on her hike, she's dealing with the loss of her mom. So that's the end of the reading. Just come to class and be ready to do the work, and I will see you in class. Bye.